Welcome to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Join us as we dive into the world of endurance sports, exploring everything from nutrition to training and how these elements shape your everyday life, both on and off the race course. Hosted by Coach Justin, certified run and triathlon coach and owner of Tabula Rasa Racing, along with Coach Katie, a registered dietitian specializing in sports nutrition and owner of Fuel to Run. We're here to share insights and real-world advice to help you thrive on your journey. Here at the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast is where your journey begins. Welcome, everyone, to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. I'm your host, Coach Justin. I'm here with Coach Katie, and welcome. This is episode 40, and today's topic is the role of fat for endurance athletes. So we hear a lot of conversation and discussion over carbohydrates and protein. Those particular topics in particular are just well covered across multiple spectrums of podcasts, as well as our coverage of those particular topics. But you rarely hear a discussion on how fat utilization and the role of fat in terms of as a fueling source and as a source of recovery. And so today we wanted to bring you a discussion on this particular macronutrient, and Katie, with her extensive background and her specialty in sports nutrition, is going to be leading the discussion. So I don't want to spend too much time as a lead-in, so I want to turn this over to Coach Katie, and she's going to lead the discussion today on the role of fat for endurance athletes. Katie, go ahead and take it away.
So we're going to dive right in today. And I know sometimes we do have a little bit of a discussion, but I think I want to make sure that we get through everything and do it in a timely manner. And sometimes I know there's questions that come up and we dive deep. So like you said, I think endurance athletes do focus a lot on carbohydrates and protein. And I know there is always kind of this focus on those two because they play a very specific role if you think like protein and muscle and carbohydrates and fuel. So I think fat kind of gets left out a little bit. And a lot of the discussion around fat is predominantly the kind of low carb, high fat discussion. And that's not what we're talking about today. I mean, we might dive into that a little bit about how we utilize fat during exercise, but we're not going to talk about or recommend doing like a high fat, low carb diet. That might be more of a discussion when we talk about metabolic efficiency. And, we might bring that in a little bit, but this is just more about how in general fat can play a role in maybe fueling, but also definitely recovery and just meeting our general caloric needs and kind of the role of different fats in general in health. And maybe some fats maybe not so helpful. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And so it's more just like, I feel like fat gets left out of the conversation sometimes. So we're going to give fat the spotlight today. So I just want to mention that because I think sometimes when there is a discussion on fat, it's a lot of times just the kind of low carb, high fat discussion. And that's not exactly what we're talking about. But let's kind of dive into the discussion of fat in general and what it's doing. I think generally it's a necessary nutrient. So we have essential fatty acids that our body needs in order to, be alive. Like they're part of cellular structures. They're part of our brain. I mean, fats are kind of similar in some ways to protein. Triglycerides just kind of are something that's like transported through the blood to go to use as fuel. I mean, there's different roles that fat play, so it is an essential nutrient. Some fats are essential, some aren't. And so we're going to talk a little bit about I'm going to try really hard not to go into like biochemistry lesson here because I think it can get a little bit interesting and very deep when we talk about the different kinds of fats, but I'm going to try to kind of overview that a little bit. And we'll talk about, like I said, fat as fuel for exercise and then fat as recovery. So what do you think? Should we do like kind of go through like some of the very basics of fat, like a little review for people? Would that be helpful, you think?
I would. I seem to think, I tend to think that fat has been, it's one of those macronutrients that we've been taught to avoid.
Mhm.
through like the whole like
Yeah.
low fat craze and
Mhm.
trying to maintain weight, so we gotta reduce fat, and it's something that we're trying to that we've been conditioned to stay away from. So
That's
what
the truth,
I'm
yeah.
really kind of interested in is just kind of the basic foundations of
Chance
how
of
the
it, yeah.
body uses it and
Uses it, and then,
what's
yeah,
its importance and things like that. So
I
yeah.
think that's a good point because and, this is true for a lot of like, I think especially for carbs and fats, there's always like a villain. It's
Mm.
like even protein now, and I don't want to get too much into this conversation, but it just seems like there's always like a macronutrient that people want to somehow bring some sort of controversy about, right? So it's like, but think about the 90s, and yeah, it was like fat is what is causing everyone to be overweight, and then we kind of made fat the villain, and then we had things like Snackwells. I don't know if you remember those
Oh yeah, I
cookies. My
remember. Yeah.
mom used to get those, and I was like, "These are awful."
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, they were fat-free, like, that's gonna solve the issue. Everybody just had sugar, and then it's like now sugar and carbs are the that it was sugar and carbs are the villain, and I think in some ways, I wasn't privy to this, but I was listening to something, and I guess now fat is or proteins kind of being I don't know, like it's just something that happens, and it's crazy to me because we actually kind of need all of these macronutrients. None of them are really the villain. I think it comes down to like overdoing it, maybe having too much of one thing or just having too much of everything. But
Yeah.
it's not necessarily one is bad, and I'm definitely not gonna say that fat is bad in this because especially for endurance athletes because we do need it. But it is a good point. So let's talk about the good thing. No, let's talk about
Yeah.
fat, and hopefully people who are still kind of afraid of fat or um, limiting it in their diet will be less afraid, and we'll kind of know how maybe to add fats in a good way, in a way that's helpful. So like the basics, so fat is let's just kind of start about where fat is found. Like what is it in? Like what foods are we eating that contain fat? And I think people kind of know this, but it's going to be like seeds and nuts are pretty high in fat. Avocado is pretty very high in fat. Olives are high fat. So we find it in like fatty meats and cheese, so dairy products. So obviously some of these foods are also containing other things. So you think of nuts, we also have fiber and a little bit of protein, whereas cheese, we do have fat, but it also contains a little bit of protein. So some foods, a lot of the foods that have fat also have other
Yeah.
macronutrients, specifically usually protein. Because if you think of like meat, it's going to contain protein. And then depending on the fattiness of that meat, it will also contain sometimes quite a bit of fat. And so but we also have some of those more refined, like, or processed fats, I suppose you could call it, because they have to be processed in some way in order to get to this form where they're purely fat. So it's going to be like butter, oil, like any kind of oil, vegetable oil, olive oil, avocado oil. Those are all have to be processed in some way to create an oil. Or butter or coconut oil is another one people like to use. And those are all obviously like more purely fat. So it just kind of gives you an example. And sometimes it's hard to track fat in the diet because when the foods we eat do contain other nutrients. In general, that's kind of where you're going to find a lot of the fat. I probably left out something, but it's mostly in those foods. And when we're looking at fat, and this is where I want to kind of not get too in the weeds with like the biochemistry portion. But when you're looking at fat, you have like two different kinds. You have saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Basically, the saturation, that means like if it's a saturated fat, it's fully saturated with hydrogen atoms and it has no double bonds. So it's like saturated, like that's kind of what it means. It's saturated,
Okay.
no double bonds. When you have an unsaturated fat, it means that there are double bonds and it's not fully saturated with hydrogen atoms because the double bonds kind of mess that up. It just creates it so it's not fully saturated. So unsaturated fats have some amount of double bonds. Monounsaturated fats, when you hear that mono, it means there's only one double bond. If it's poly, like a polyunsaturated fat, it has more than one. So that kind of is how you differentiate the different types of fat. And so this is where it gets a little bit complicated because if you hear the word, I think where a popular fat we hear is omega-3 fatty acids. So that is just based off of where that double bond is placed. So if you think of fats, they're like several like carbon atoms like linked together, or several. It's like several carbon atoms. There's hydrogen, and then I wish I could draw it out. Maybe what I should have done is created like a little visual for people. But the double bond, there's double bonds in there. For the omega-3, there's like a methyl group on one side, and it's like 3 down from that side. So that's like omega-3 is how they distinguish. Anyways, it's very, very chemistry. This is reminding me a lot of organic chemistry, which I took years and years ago. So it's like trying to I'm getting like some flashbacks of like trying to draw out each molecule. And yeah, I actually did okay in that class, but I don't remember a lot of it. I should probably, but it's more of like, it's basically just like, that's how we distinguish poly, mono, and then unsaturated and saturated fats are like completely saturated. And so that's about all we probably need to say about that. But if I do mention those different types of fat, I just want to kind of have, so people can kind of have an idea. Saturated fats are more solid at room temperature. So if you think about like if you have butter or something like coconut oil sitting out on the counter, it's not like a super warm day, that usually stays pretty solid. It might be soft, but it's not going to be like melting or liquid. If you take butter, you have to like put it in the microwave and heat it up, and then it will become liquid. Whereas like polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats are going to be more liquid at room temperature. So those fats, we kind of think of like oils, don't tend to be solid unless you put them in the fridge or freezer. Like I've put, like peanut oil or something in the fridge, and it does become a little bit more solid. So that's another way to kind of think of like the saturated versus unsaturated, is also like what their form is like just sitting out. Another thing to kind of think about is, some people kind of think about, is the cooking, like the heating point, or there's a name for it, but anyways, like how hot the oil can get before it starts to smoke. And so that's why things like coconut oil and butter and certain oils are, I think even vegetable oil, are a little bit better at cooking at high temperatures, because they have a lower smoking point. They have a higher, smoking point. Versus like if you use olive oil, if you've ever cooked with olive oil, it starts to smoke. That's usually not a good sign. We don't want it to smoke, because it can be the way it when it starts to smoke, the chemical change there isn't a great thing. So we want to make sure we try to use the appropriate oil to cook with. But those are just some general things. Like, I don't know if you have anything you've heard about just generally fat, or if that was a fairly good overview. Try.
I'd never heard of any of this stuff, so I never took
We learned
organic
something.
chemistry or anything like that. But my question is that if you have the monosaturated and polyunsaturated fat, the bonding of it, does that mean that it takes more for the body to break that down? So if it's polyunsaturated fat, does that mean that it takes more to break that bond?
Not really. I think it's
Okay.
and that's a good question, but not necessarily. It's one thing to keep in mind is that the longer the chain, the longer that like carbon chain, the harder it is to break it down. So sometimes people, like you might have heard of like medium chain triglycerides are shorter, so they're a little bit easier for the body to process. But the process of actually breaking it down is a little bit harder than carbohydrates. So it just takes a little bit more, because you have to break each thing, you have to break each bond. It just takes a little bit more. With carbs, they're similar in the way that they're like sometimes several sugars can be bonded together, but we have it's just a little easier for the body in the gut to kind of break those sugars apart, and then it's absorbed as glucose. Whereas fats are sometimes transported a little differently. They're absorbed, and then they're usually processed a little bit differently. So it just takes a little bit longer. So then as we get into the why fat isn't something we can readily take in while we're exercising and use, and what happens when we try to do that, let's just keep that in mind. Fat is a very energy dense nutrient. So that's something I didn't mention yet, but fat contains, so 1 gram of fat has 9 calories, and then 1 gram of protein has 4, and 1 gram of carbs has 4 calories. So you can see how there's like almost double the amount of calories. So you would think, oh my gosh, like that's an abundant amount of calories. We have lots of energy there. The unfortunate thing is the breaking down of that, of fat in general is a little bit challenging. It's not as fast. So
Hmm.
that's kind of a limitation when it comes to fueling, and we will talk about that a little bit. The other thing is to keep in mind is when it comes to storage in the body, fat is abundant. I mean, most people, even if you're very, very lean, have at least hundreds of thousands of calories. I mean, I don't know the exact number because it probably depends on how much fat, someone has, but it's a lot. Even a lean person has quite a bit of fat stored in their body, enough to maybe last them several days before they have to start
Hmm.
burning heart muscle or something like that. And if you think about protein, the only way we store protein, the only storage form is really like the muscle and the other tissue in our body. It's not readily stored, right? Otherwise, if we just
Yeah.
ate protein and stored it, we'd all be like bodybuilders. We'd be huge, muscular. Well, it doesn't work that way, right? The only way we store it is by eating it and then doing something to simulate muscle growth. So we don't have there's some protein kind of through, maybe floating around in the body, but not enough to really last us very long. And then
Right.
carbs are also limited, although we do store carbs as glycogen. It's stored predominantly in our liver and our muscle. And we only
Right.
have, I think it's like 12, maybe 1,300 calories. It's not very much. It probably depends on the person, how much muscle mass they have and their size, but like it isn't much. That's going to wear out if you were to get lost on the mountain and not have any food and you were trying to, survive. The carbs are going to only get you so far. And then you're going to have to rely on fat and maybe
Yeah.
muscle protein. But so just to keep that in mind is that the fat is more stored fairly readily. And that kind of gets us into trouble, I think, because if you eat a lot of extra calories, the body also has the ability to process those carbs and store them so we can actually take fat or carbs and make them into triglycerides and store that. It becomes fat. So we can take carbs readily and turn it into fat and store it on our body, but also the fat we eat. And I don't want to again, I think that's why fat kind of gets villainized because people sort of think of, oh, fat is bad because it makes me fat. And it's not necessarily always fat that's the culprit, right? So it's something to kind of keep in mind. Any thoughts? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
Moving through
I
this.
think that's kind of interesting is that, I mean, fat, yeah, can be stored throughout the body, everywhere. Protein is stored in the muscle, effectively. And then
Mhm.
carbs are either stored in the muscle or in the liver. So that tends to be the two places. So it makes sense on why fat would be such a hard energy source because it has to be accumulated throughout the entire body. Protein is stored in muscle, carbohydrate is stored in muscle and liver, but
Mhm.
fat is stored throughout, like
Throughout, yeah, it's
everywhere.
kind of
And so
every,
it's like
yeah.
trying to herd cats, You're
Well,
just
kind
trying
of.
to
I mean,
pull fat from everywhere.
and where we pull fat from is probably largely genetic in a way because yeah, it is everywhere. I mean, it's a purpose too. I mean, fat is in our body, in around our organs to protect them. So there's a
Mm,
protective mechanism there, and it is like, you know, kind of stored. Yeah, I mean, under our skin, kind of throughout our body. And where we store it is very genetic, and where we pull from is very genetic. So, you always hear that, like, I'm going to spot treat this. I'm just going to do a bunch of setups. Unfortunately, that's not how it works because if you tend
yeah,
to store fat in your midsection, that's probably very genetic. And then that's probably for those people the very last place that it comes from. That's kind of my genetics is more like in my midsection versus some people kind of store it more in their glute region. And then so where that when you start to exercise, where that's coming from is hard. It's hard, because it's just pulling from whatever area, is
right.
with
Yeah.
and some places might be getting the fat sort of broken down quicker. So, and I don't know if that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with like any research behind like when you exercise, is there a specific place that tends to come from more than others? Because the body can kind of where we have it stored. I mean, we can kind of liberalize that a little bit as needed. But like I said, it's not like super, super easy. Like it is abundant and we do use it for exercise, but it's not
It's just
something
hard to
that is
use.
hard
Yeah.
to use. Yeah, it's hard to use at high intensity exercise. So, but you're right. It's stored. I mean, we all know it. It's like you have fat, we would have like, fat in our face. And that's why sometimes I think like there's a lot of things going on as we age, but people kind of lose a little bit of collagen, but also sometimes just where our fat stores that sometimes even make us look a little bit younger, and we lose that as we age and things change.
And I think that's why
That's a whole discussion.
carbohydrates were given such a bad rap, was because the failure to, or the low utilization rate of carbohydrates, because it converts to fat to be stored
Mhm.
at a later time, is
Uh,
probably why carbohydrates were given such a bad rap at one point in time, because
yeah.
people were eating them in such a way that they weren't utilizing them, and it was just going
Mhm.
through that transformation process and being stored. I mean, the body is
Yeah.
smart, and that it's like, oh, well, I'm just going to save this for later,
Yeah, our
but
good friend insulin has
yeah,
lots of a little, that's a hormone, but I if people don't know that, but you eat a lot of carb, the body can only handle so much carb at once. Like, if you've ever used this continuous glucose monitor, you would see that it goes you eat a big amount of carb, and your body can't utilize that because there's nowhere to store it beyond glycogen. So you think of glycogen I think of it like cubby holes, like, you have a certain amount of cubby holes. You eat a meal high in carb, all those cubby holes, glycogen is being stored and filled up. And then you eat, let's say you don't do any exercise, you're just lying on the couch, and then you do another high carb meal. Well, now the body's like, I don't have any more cubby holes. Like, I'm out of
yeah,
storage. And we've got to put that somewhere because we do not want to have a lot of sugar, like glucose, in our blood
yeah,
just to high amounts because it's toxic. So the body's like, okay, I need to figure this out. I'm gonna turn this into triglycerides or the fat, and I'm gonna store it. And the sort of the mechanism to do that, or one of the hormones that does it, that facilitates that, is insulin. We need insulin. It's important. It's a very important one to survive. Otherwise,
hmm,
our glucose levels would be um, very, very high, and we'd be in trouble, right? Because we wouldn't have anywhere to get that glucose into the cells. But it can be problematic when it comes to weight and weight gain and maintaining weight, or just or having excess body fat. So it's not just generally fat. I mean, fat too. If you eat more of too much of it, it will be stored as well. But I don't
yeah,
think people sometimes realize that. And I'm not trying to say that carbs are bad in any way. Like, this isn't an
no,
attack on carbs. It's just something you want to be mindful of. This is why you want to be strategic about kind of the composition of your meals. And we'll talk about that with fat too. Like, carbs are really going to be what you want to predominantly have around your workout so you can fuel your workout. When it comes to fat, though, I don't know if you've ever experienced this. Like, this is where we can kind of dive into like the fat fuel utilization thing. But I remember one time, and I've done this a few times, where I've kind of maybe like mismatched the timing of my meal with my run or something like that. But I remember distinctly, like, when I was in college, I worked at a Mexican restaurant, and they had tamales, and I remember eating, like, 3 tamales, which are actually kind of fatty. They're made with, like, masa and, like, lard, and I she's like, "I'm gonna go for a run," like, 30 minutes later, and I didn't go
yeah.
well. It was
That
so
doesn't
much
sound
fat.
like it would go well.
It did not go well. I think most people have like, a lot of people experience that. Like, I've talked to, like, high school athletes or college athletes that, like, I had McDonald's and french fries and a burger, like, an hour ago, and I'm like, "Oh, good luck with that." Like, you're gonna feel like crap, you know what I mean? And there's a reason. I mean, that's a lot of food to begin with, like, a lot to process. I mean, it could take that, like, 3 hours or so to be able to process that meal before we had it kinda emptied through our system, and the reason is because fat is a slow to digest food. It takes a bit, not only for the body to utilize it for energy, but it takes a lot to actually digest and absorb it. It's just a slower process. So when we eat fat, that's why when we have a really fat meal, high fat meal, it seems like it takes a while to, like, move through our system because the fat's slowing it all down. And that can be a really great thing if you're trying, I mean, in a way, like, you don't want to overdo the fat because it's high calorie, but it can be helpful if you're just trying to kind of fill up and feeling satiated. But it's
Mhm.
not a very great thing right before you go for a run. So in general, we're going to recommend like a lower carb or lower fat, high carb meal, maybe a little bit of protein, moderate, because protein also takes a little bit longer to digest. Maybe 2 hours, 1 to 2 hours before you go out. If you have 3 hours, then you can probably have that higher fat meal, but you just need to give it a little more time. And that's why. it just takes a lot for our body. And then if you think about it, once you get on that run or you get into that like workout, all the blood's being pulled from the gut, a lot of that blood to kind of start bringing nutrients and fuel to the muscle, and all of a sudden, and oxygen and all that, and then all of a sudden your gut is even working at half the rate because it's now
Yeah.
doesn't have the blood flow. So you're kind of you can be in a pukey situation, or you can have a real bathroom issue. You know what I mean? Like it's just not going to
Yeah,
work
it makes sense.
well. So I think most people have experienced that, and I think most people know intuitively, like, don't eat a lot of fat before and even during. This is why it's very hard. I think you would think, oh, there's so many calories and fat. Like, what if we just fueled with fat during? And I think unless you're doing something like a ultra endurance thing, like I remember during my ultra, I did have a couple pieces of bacon at one point because it just sounded really good. But I was also going at a pretty like zone 2 tempo. So it was only a couple pieces too, but it didn't have a significant impact on my gut. I just sounded really good at the moment. And so probably in retrospect that might I was fine, but maybe not the best choice, but it wasn't like I was going all out in a marathon. I would never do that. So it kind of depends on your intensity, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. Oh, MCT oils got really popular because people were like, "Oh, you can use them for fuel." The problem is you can only take in a little bit, like maybe I don't know, like a tablespoon of it before it becomes a problem in your gut. And people were trying to take in MCT oils, or they were adding some of those to like products for fueling, and people were having like severe gut distress, or they were starting to have gut problems. And so
Uh,
there isn't really like I mean, the only thing, and I won't get into this today because it's almost its own special topic, would be like ketones, which is kind of not the same. It's almost
okay.
its own macronutrient, but it is something that is processed from fat, and people go into ketosis. It's a whole topic we can talk about almost on its own of what is a ketone and how is that used for fueling. But that would be because sometimes people do take ketones in, and it's processed more rapidly, very, very differently. But in terms of actually taking in fat, it's not helpful. It doesn't tend to work very well because you can get such GI problems from it because it takes so long. So when we're talking about fat-free fuel during exercise, it's really going to be the fat that we have stored or kind of in our system already, because because we have so much fat stored. And it's actually a little bit easier for the body to kind of mobilize that fat and use it for energy than to actually try to take it up through the gut, and especially for trying to take it in during exercise. So the body will mobilize, and that's a good thing, right? In a way,
Yeah.
if you're trying to lose fat, a good one thing you can try to utilize is exercise to sort of mobilize some of that fat. But the problem is that sort of that crossover concept of like when we burn fat and when we kind of cross over a little bit more into burning more carb.
Yeah.
However, I mean, we can talk about that a little bit, but any thoughts?
I've never heard of MCT oils, so
Oh,
I'm
okay.
not quite sure like what
You
those
weren't sure.
are.
It's like a medium. It's like I said, it's like a medium chain triglyceride. So it's like I mentioned before, there are long chain like fats or triglycerides that are longer carbon chains that are like a lot of the other oils we have in butter and things like that are more of a longer chain. The medium chain is just a shorter chain. It's, I don't know if I can explain the entire biochemistry of it, but it's just a little bit more readily taken in, absorbed, and used by the body, but it's still not fast enough if you take in a lot of it
Yeah.
to be absorbed as quickly as like sugar or carbs are. So it's still a little bit of a limiting factor there. So I've tried it before where I've added a little bit, especially this had to be back during my ultra training. So this was like back in 2017. It's been a while. But I remember making my own little gels like out of sweet potatoes and maple syrup, and I added just a tiny bit of MCT oils. But it was just maybe a teaspoon in this whole big pouch that I made. So it wasn't very much. And then I've experimented with trying to have it in my coffee, and it did like before workouts, and it did kind of give me some GI problems. So it definitely, I don't know if it's something you can kind of train your gut to do, but there's a reason why athletes aren't using MCT oils in their products
Okay.
generally. But that's basically, it's just a shorter, easier, there's less carbons to break down or cut, to cut the bonds from, so to be used for energy. So that's kind of what the thought was. But yeah. Yeah, that kind of overview of that. So the fat is slower digesting, but so we kind of covered that. I think most people kind of understand that intuitively. And then I think also most people kind of understand that fat is utilized during exercise. So it's not as though I are either using fat or carb. You're always using a mixture of both. Even in the lowest intensity, it's just that the mixture of fat you're using might be up to like 80% fat and like 20% carb. And, so I'm talking like zone 1 walking into like a really easy zone 2. You could probably go on like that actually for hours. You might be able to do like 2 or 3 hours like that before you really have a significant decrease in glycogen if you were to do that fasted. Maybe, it depends on the person. Some people are better at burning fat than others or have more of adaptation to burn fat. But as the intensity rises, there's that crossover concept, right? Where it's kind of like we're mostly burning fat. Fat's like here and carbs are kind of coming up. And then all of a sudden you're crossing over and then carbs are going to be the predominant source and fat starts to go down. And there's a point in intensity where we're burning 100% carb. I mean, so yeah, there's probably at maximal intensity, like you're sprinting all out, that you're very glycolytic and there really is very little fat. But that's like all out, right? So there's going to be this like crossover where we're burning more carb and less fat. And there's a way to kind of push that a little bit so you're able to burn more fat, but nobody's going to be able to burn fat at that very high intensity because we need rapid fuel. And as I said before, fat is not a rapidly broken down for fuel. That's why when we're going slow and steady and we are using lots of oxygen, it's just easier to utilize the fat. And so that's kind of something to think about. But it's not something where, I mean, if you want to, the thing you have to kind of think about is also like the amount of energy we're burning. So if you're at a zone 2 or zone 1 and you're just walking, you might be burning 100 calories in like 15 minutes, right? If you're doing like a 6-minute mile or I don't know, like a 7-minute mile, you're burning 100 calories in like 7 minutes. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, so
Yeah.
there's more carbs, but there's also still fat being burned. Like that's something I think people miss is like, they're like, oh, I'm going to go do like slow and steady. I'm going to burn all this fat. Well, you're actually probably, if you just increase your pace a little bit, like you're probably still burning. It's close to the
Yep.
same amount of fat because you're just having to get the calories from somewhere. So just keeping that in mind too. Like I'm not knocking like the zone 2 or like trying to do some work in that sort of very low zone training, but the amount of actually energy you're burning is going to be far less. And so it may not actually be like the most phenomenal fat burning tool unless you're going to be out there for like 3 hours. You know what I mean? Like so don't, I think people kind of forget about that. Like you could
Yeah.
burn 100 calories in 7 minutes or in 15. And not that I'm trying to ever burn calories when I'm out on a run. That's not what I'm focusing on. I'm just focusing on my training. But if you are trying to lose weight or burn fat, you don't necessarily want to totally ignore some of those faster paces.
Yeah,
Is
that was
that
one of the things that I kind of wanted to play around with because there's a new feature that is in Training Peaks where they've now created an algorithm and it's only for the cycling profiles. So if you go in and if you have a power meter, that's kind of like one of the criteria that you have to have. So if you have a power meter and you're reading in power and you do a cycle workout, it now will show you the breakdown between carbohydrate expenditure and fat expenditure. And those two numbers will add up to its new caloric expenditure. But if you're recording your workout with a Garmin and you go into Garmin Connect and you look at the calories burned in Garmin, it's going to be different now between Garmin and Training Peaks. Even though Training Peaks is grabbing the data from Garmin, it's now going to calculate its own caloric expenditure, and those two numbers are going to roll up to each other. So I've been taking a look at this breakdown, and you can only see it if you use
power
Training
meter?
Peaks with your computer. They still don't have that ability to look at this breakdown through the mobile app for some reason. I don't know. They just haven't rolled out that feature. But I've been playing around with it as I've been training for Florida because I've been curious about the distribution of my expenditure. Like, how easy do I have to go in order to raise the fat utilization and start to minimize the carbohydrate utilization? And it looks like you have to go incredibly slow and easy, because
Yeah.
I don't see, I haven't been really training at like really high levels, but still that ratio is anywhere between 70-30 and 80-20. It
Okay.
has been my utilization. So it's like 80% is still carbohydrate expenditure
Interesting.
and only 20% is fat. And so
Yes.
after Florida is over and I kind of shift my focus now to trying to lose some more weight, because, we've talked before on how incredibly hard it is to lose weight during a training cycle. And so once I'm done with the training cycle, I really want to focus on shedding some more of my weight. But I don't know how easy I'm going to have to go in order to improve that
Right.
utilization.
Yeah, and that's where I think maybe that discussion of the metabolic flexibility will come in, because you might be able to do some things to kind of, improve that without having to do hours and hours and months of like really low zone two. And also it's a little hard. Like, I'm skeptical. I think the only best way to really get those sorts of measurements is to go into a lab and actually have them do like almost like a metabolic test. Sometimes they'll do like a full on like lactate threshold and VO2 max, but you'll wear them a mask, which is like kind of sucky. But and then what they do is they measure like a RER, or like a respiratory quotient, and it's just basically the way they're measuring it. It's a very as accurate as they can get. They're measuring like your CO2 expellation. You expel CO2 and you
Hmm.
intake or breathe in O2, oxygen, and they're measuring kind of like there's a whole equation they use to kind of figure that out, and it's pretty scientific. As long as you can go like, here we have one at Colorado State University. They do like actual testing, so I feel
Uh,
I've thought about it, but they're doing it in a lab, and at the university. I feel pretty good about it being pretty accurate. So, to really get an idea of, you unfortunately would have to kind of do it if you're on a bike or the run. I mean, you might be able to extrapolate it a little bit, but that would probably be the most scientific way to do it. I don't know. I'm skeptical how much that's actually how accurate that actually is, but but like, I think the good thing is if you try to do some things that you can change, like do some testing or some different, not testing, but different, maybe try some lower carb or maybe some fasted workouts, or like a lower carb, sort of situation, just for a period of time where you really try to push that. You can maybe see it improve. Even if it's not 100% accurate, my thought is it probably would improve in some way in that parameters that you're getting through the
yeah.
training peaks, or so. Um, yeah, it's hard, I think, sometimes to get a really good idea of. That's why it's challenging, because we're not gonna know, like, necessarily. I think the only sign that I could say is if you ever do a fasted run and it's like you're an hour in and you're just like, "My gosh, I'm hitting the wall already." That might be a
Hmm.
sign that you're not really well fat adapted,
Yeah.
depending on the intensity of that, though. So if it's just like a regular long run, easy pace, and you're running out, so there's probably some subjective things you can do, but it's hard to really get an idea for any just general athlete to figure out where they are. How much fat are they using and at what intensities, and can they push that a little further? And those tests aren't cheap. It
Yeah.
is sometimes hard to, and so maybe all you have is what you're getting through training peaks, and so that's fine. I think if you can do a few strategies to try to push that a little bit, the fat portion that you're burning a little bit higher, you'll probably see that in training peaks if you're
Yeah.
doing some of those strategies. But I think that is, I'm talking about this, and then I think for most people it's just not really feasible to do some of those tests, and that's
Yeah.
fine. But it is not maybe necessarily, I think if you're really struggling to lose body fat, it might be worth looking into a little bit. But if you're, for a lot of folks out there, like, I think it is also something you could probably get into the weeds a little bit and get all the testing done and still be like, I don't know how. like, how am I interpreting this? What am I supposed to do with it? Like,
Hmm.
how is this helping me? Like, maybe so just something to think about if you're going to go out and do like a bunch of testing to kind of be able to have it and then maybe make some changes or try some different things and then see if you can improve that time or that percentage of fat you're burning at higher intensities. But at some
Yeah.
point, it does cross over.
I know that there's at least one thing that I do want to go back to, and it was the satiation factor.
Hmm.
And it was one of the things that I didn't really realize until I started working with you was that, we would go through my meal plan and I'd be like, hey, I eat this and then, I'm hungry. I'm getting hungrier sooner.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that, I've been conditioned to think is that, if you give me a snack that has yogurt, like a yogurt based snack, yogurt, granola, fruit, or whatever, I would automatically default to the fat free yogurt. And because I've been conditioned to grab that off of the shelf because it's fat free and my goal is to lose weight. So therefore I want to consume less fat. Let's talk about that, because what you've actually shown me and what I've learned through this whole process is that opting for these quote unquote low fat and like fat free foods is actually causing us to eat more. And so kind of can we go through
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
satiation
Think
thing?
of,
And I
yeah,
think
this is a
that'll
good
help.
topic. Yeah, we'll talk about that. And then we'll kind of dive into like also like a little more about fats the rest of the day and kind of, and that I think that leads into it a little bit. Like why, like you wouldn't, so we talked about why we wouldn't necessarily want to have a lot of fat right before our run. But let's say the
Yeah.
rest of the day, not just because some fats are essential and we do need some fat to survive, but that's a really good point. And if you think about that example, like let's take the Greek yogurt and like half a cup of berries and some granola, like half a cup or so. If you do the low fat yogurt or the totally fat free yogurt and the berries and the granola may have some nuts in it, maybe a little bit of fat, but that's like mostly carbs and protein. And like I
Yeah.
said before, carbs are burnt through pretty quickly. So, and also if you kind of were to look at a glucose curve, like if you had a CGM. I just have a lot of experience with CGM, so I like to use it as an example. Like in that meal, because the protein may slow down the digestion just a little bit, you might have like a rise that kind of comes up quickly and comes down pretty quickly. And by
Yeah.
the time, if you're looking at it on a graph, like the glucose levels come up and then the body, releases insulin and starts using that glucose and then it comes down, but it might be very quickly. And then all of a sudden it's coming down and 2 hours later, you're like, I'm hungry, again, and I just ate, an hour or two before. If you have some fat, so I recommend like especially for athletes, like a full fat Greek yogurt. Don't do the fat free. You don't need to. In fact, most athletes probably need a little extra energy, and fat provides a good amount of energy. But maybe if you're not willing to do that, try adding in some walnuts or some nuts or something. And the fat there will slow down digestion. And I've seen it, also in the glucose data, because that slower digestion, the curve may be more rounded. So it may not even come up as high, maybe more rounded, and more like slow. So like kind of up and then maybe 3 hours later, it's kind of coming down. And that's actually, as long as it doesn't go way high, that's actually okay. They're never like spiking up as high and, having that larger delta that we kind of call it, that larger shift. So
Yeah.
you'll probably then 3 or 4 hours later be like, I'm hungry again. And that's exactly what we want. Of course, like if you're burning a lot of energy, you might be hungry 2 hours later anyways, but you're gonna just feel more satisfied. Of course, there's probably a limit. So, if you had a ton of huge high fat meal, it's probably additional fat may not help even more, but it's just finding ways to kind of add a little bit of fat. I think in general, if people are thinking, well, how much fat do I need every day? Fat, I usually like to estimate it based off percentage of calories. So it's going to be somewhere like 25 to maybe up to 40% of daily calories as fat. So I think people,
Wow.
if you're kind of thinking, I think in general, that's probably for most people somewhere between like 60 and 120 grams, So it's not like, because, remember, it's high calories. So if you have
Mhm.
like 900 calories worth of fat, which would be a lot, that would be like 90 grams or something. Am I thinking that right? But, so it's like, um, if you take 3,000 calories and you sort of do that percentage, it's most people will kind of fall somewhere in between, most athletes between like 60 to maybe 120 grams of fat a day. And so you can kind of think of it that way if you just wanted to get an idea of how much fat. I don't tend to recommend very low fat diets, less than like 20% of calories for athletes. There are some people out there like Dean Ornish who are really into like heart health. They're working with people who've had like maybe real severe heart issues, recommending really low fat. I don't think that's a good idea for athletes. So unless you happen to be a very special person, not special, but like you are an athlete but also have a really high risk of heart disease or something, then maybe you can play around with a lower fat intake. And then you do maybe want to be careful about things like saturated fats, which I know people have heard a lot about. There's this big debate. I'm not going to go into this huge debate about saturated fats and how they might risk or increase risk for cardiovascular disease. It is true, like they do for especially certain people who are susceptible. It can raise your LDL cholesterol. And for someone who maybe has familial high cholesterol, meaning genetic high cholesterol, or a history of myocardial infarction, which is essentially like a heart attack, probably saturated fat is something you want to limit a little bit. It's not a very high amount of saturated fat, but there's a little bit of wiggle room there. And if you don't have a lot of those genetic factors, then it's probably less of a concern. The one thing I want to mention when I'm talking about all of these types of fats is that really, ideally, you would be getting this from food. My general thought, I don't count the saturated fat in my diet because I try to get all of my fat from food and limit a lot of those additive fats. So yes, occasionally I have like a cookie where I make like it has butter in it, or I'll cook with a little bit of oil. Like I have avocado spray that I spray, but I don't eat a lot of butter. I don't add a ton of coconut oil to things. I don't drink butter coffees. I don't generally think that's a good idea. I just don't understand why would you. That's a lot of calories. It's like 300 calories in your coffee. I have people trying to lose weight doing that. And I'm like, what are you doing? This is not a good idea. You're like, well, and there's no nutrients in that too. That's just fat too. When you're doing oils and butter and coconut, it's just fat. There's no vitamins, minuscule amounts of anything else. So it's not a fantastic way to get your calories. You want to kind of take advantage of also getting other nutrients along, which is going to be in food we eat. So trying to eat those foods that contain fat and minimize additive fats, fried foods. Please don't I'm just recommending you not put butter in your coffee. Don't do that. I don't know. It's something that I always was flabbergasted by. I don't know why people do that. It's like you're not getting any other nutrients.
I've heard of the butter coffee. So
it's like you're just getting calories and fat. You're not getting anything else from that. Why not eat something that's a little more nutrient dense, like a steak? I don't know. Like that probably doesn't sound good. I don't know. It's not going to go in your coffee, but at least you're getting iron and B12 and protein. There's just some trends that I've just never quite understood. So just try to stick generally just healthy like foods with fat. Some of the things I've mentioned, and if it's helpful, I kind of want to follow this up with maybe like a blog or something, and I'll maybe like try to list some of those foods again.
Here's a question that I would have for you is that let's say that we're walking through the grocery store and we're comparing items and things like that. And we've been conditioned to grab those boxes that say, low fat, no fat, fat free, all that kind of stuff. And let's say that they listen to this podcast and they're just like, you know what? They're absolutely right. Katie is a freaking genius. She knows what she's talking about. I'm not going to buy these no fat, low fat foods anymore because it's making me eat more often, right? That's an important takeaway that you can get from this podcast episode. So next is talk to me about how to determine what is a good calculation or benchmark that we can use to say this is relatively high in fat or lower in fat without it being labeled as low fat and no fat. For instance, we've talked about before the peanut butter.
Right.
And peanut butter is always just like, oh, peanut butter is great and it's got protein in it. And that's the huge selling point of peanut butter. It's just like, oh, protein. But we know that the amount of protein that you get from it is significantly less than the amount of fat that you get from it. So when you take that ratio of protein to fat, it's actually a poor source of protein. So
Right.
is there a similar methodology that we can use to determine on whether there is a good source of fat or a bad source of fat?
I mean, I think it's just like looking at your plate because I think when it comes to packaged foods, kind of maybe looking at the label. If you're looking at like a label, I think looking at the fat total and seeing like, is this because some foods like peanut butter are naturally higher in fat. That doesn't make them bad.
Right.
You have to look. It's like, wow, this has like 16, 15 grams of fat and only 8 grams of protein. So it's like double the amount of fat. You might want to look at like just learn how to look at labels. But if you're looking at ingredients, like looking to see if there's added oils, and the closer they are to the very top of the list, the more of that, whatever that is in that thing. So if it's like soybean oil is the first thing on the list, or, some kind of vegetable oil or whatever coconut oil, you'll know, wow, there's a lot of fat in this, I think that's one way. But I think generally, if you can try to look at your plate, um, and this is why fat's so much in food too. So there's not really, if you think about like the plate model, which is like the general recommendation is like half your plate is veggies, a quarter is starch, and a quarter is protein. Why you don't see fat on there is because a lot of times we have fat already in the foods we eat, kind of mixed in. I think it's a little harder to be like, is this, like what's the perfect plate? Because you might have some slices of avocado, in your salad, or you might, the meat will have some fat. So it's harder for me to be like, oh, you got to look for this. But I think in packaged goods, just trying to be aware to look at the food label, look at the ingredients, see what's in it. If there's a lot of fat and oils or butter or coconut oil, maybe that's something you just want to limit. But on your plate, if you can just kind of look and be like, oh, do I have some fat in this plate? Is there some healthy fat? Can I add maybe a few slices of avocado to get some heart healthy fats, or some olives or something like that? Maybe some seeds on top of my salad. So thinking about ways to kind of add some of those healthy fats if you're kind of looking and you're like, this doesn't have a lot of fat in it. Um, just because it's a lot in the foods we eat, it's just harder to be like distinctly this is a fat food versus other nutrients. There's only a couple I think like avocado or is one that's like predominantly fat. But that's, I think just overall kind of thinking about it that way. And then because maybe as athletes we're limiting fat certain times of the training to make sure we add, we might have to add a little more of a healthy fat to some of your other meals. And so it's a little bit more about how we're balancing it through the day.
Let's talk about then what is a healthy fat? How do you classify something as a healthy fat? Is it the ratio of unsaturated fat to total fat is what classifies it as healthy?
That's kind of those what I classify as heart healthy fats, which is going to be generally your unsaturated fats, but generally like monounsaturated fats, which are going to be, they're kind of found in, like I mentioned, avocado quite a few times, and olives, nuts and seeds have some monounsaturated fat. So they're going to be found in some of those types of foods. So trying to add some of those foods to your meal. Polyunsaturated fats are going to be things that also like linoleic acid, omega-3 fats, like there's different kinds. And again, it's all just based off of the double bonds, where they're placed, how many, you know what I mean? So I'm not going to go into the biochemistry there, but those are generally found in, so mostly like if you think about it, a lot of our plant sources of fats, because those are so far I've mentioned only
Okay.
plants that contain fats. However, omega-3 fats come mostly from fatty fish,
Yeah.
and that's another
Yep.
one. And we'll dive into the recovery piece and why those are so important. But the omega-3 fats are mostly, I mean, we can find them in like plant algae. So for our vegan and vegetarian friends, they would maybe find like a algae-based supplement to take omega-3s, because you're just omega-3s I'm talking about are EPA and DHA specifically from fish. Those are like the heart healthy, the brain healthy fats that we hear a lot about. And if you're not really into fatty fish, so like salmon, mackerel, trout, sardines, probably missing one, but those are, fatty fish, then you would probably want to take a fish oil. And I like fish, but I live in Colorado, and we're kind of like, the salmon I get here is expensive. I do buy it, but I can't have it like 3 times a week, which is probably what's recommended. So, I'll take a fish oil supplement or a omega-3 fat supplement. So that's probably the only time I would recommend somebody like supplement with fat. But generally trying to eat those plant-based sources of fat are going to be where those heart healthy fats are. But, you know, it's not to say that like, because I'll talk a little bit about something called conjugated linoleic acids, which is another type of fat that's found in dairy and maybe some meats. But there's like different types of fats also in meats that may be beneficial that aren't necessarily all saturated fat. In fact, meat does have both saturated fat and, well, I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are unsaturated fats in beef and other like chicken and things like that as well. And just the portion is a little bit smaller. But yeah, so I hope that kind of makes sense. It's hard to distinguish because it's not like saturated fats are just all bad. We do need some in
Yeah.
our diet. It's just that we don't want a large portion. We want to kind of have a balance of all these different fats, and that's the important thing. And I think when we eat them mostly from food, we tend to get a better balance versus when we're taking in oils and butters and all that sort of stuff.
So,
But yeah.
yeah, so here's another question that I got for you is there a time, we haven't really talked a whole lot about like lean meats, the
Hmm.
fat that is contained within like a protein source. So one of the things that I've kind of discovered is, well, it's kind of interesting because I've had this insatiable desire for cheeseburgers for like 2 weeks now, and you were gracious enough to put them in the meal plan for this week, and I'm having an incredible week. I love it. I've been eating cheeseburgers every night, and I'm not sick of it yet, and it's awesome. So my question to you is there a particular time or a scenario where we should opt for the 80/20 meat versus the extra lean meat? Is there a case for having both?
There's probably a case for having both. I would lean towards lean meat more often if you can. But obviously, there's going to be times where maybe you're at a restaurant or we get a quarter of a cow. Our friend raises them. And so we get a certain portion of the meat. And so I don't really have a say. And some of the meats are fattier than others. And I do cut out. I don't like that taste. So I do cut off the fat sometimes, but it's just kind of what we get. So some cuts are lean, some cuts are fatty. I think the actual beef is like 80/20 or ground beef. So, I'm kind of stuck with that. If you cook it and you can drain off some of the fat if you're wanting to. I do think sort of mostly sticking with a little bit of the leaner meat, but that doesn't mean that you have to always. You just have to be aware that that's going to contain,
Uh,
especially if you can visibly see the fat, that's going to contain a lot of fat. And so you just have to think about the saturated fat in there and probably the calorie added, additional calories there. So yeah, maybe a mixture of both like I do because I'm kind of going to use all that meat. If you can find mostly lean, I think bison, if you have access to like bison or elk, which not everybody does.
yeah,
Venison is
no.
a great source because you're getting mostly protein there. And so, we don't, I think having fat in the diet is helpful, but we don't want to overdo it. So just kind of finding that balance. And that's why sometimes if you can do some logging, also like food logging, you can kind of get an idea of the amount of fat in meals. And sometimes it's surprising. You're like, wow, that one meal contained like 50 grams of fat, right? And my daily budget is 80. So it's just eye
Yeah.
opening because then you kind of start to see, wow, I had like 4 tablespoons of peanut butter. And my gosh, it's like 30 grams of fat, right? So it's more because sometimes it's harder to know just by looking at it. It's not as obvious as like sometimes carbs or protein is kind of how much we're getting. So I would definitely recommend like doing some logging. Oh, go ahead.
If you might be following kind of like a high volume training plan, is it worth it then saying, my training volume is this is a high volume plan, maybe I can relax it and go for the fattier meat versus the extra lean? Or if you're saying, hey, I'm training for a sprint and I don't, it's not a high volume plan,
Right.
then it may not make sense to, have the fattier meat and maybe switch to the leaner cuts. So I'm trying to figure out is like, okay, is there criteria that we can use, subjective criteria on whether we can make these substitutions and whether it's a good decision, bad decision?
Yeah. I think if you're not training as much, like your volume isn't as high, you're not burning as many calories, or you're trying to lean out a little bit, you probably want to, you still want, it's a balance because you still want some fat to help that satiety, but you might want to have more of the leaner cuts of meat and kind of being aware of that a little bit more. Whereas an athlete training at a very high volume needs a lot of energy. And I think there's such a risk of underfueling because, I've been there before where I'm training so much and sometimes my appetite actually declines a little bit. I'm not as hungry. So adding a little bit more fat in that situation might be helpful just to get the calories that you need. And so in that case, I mean, that's also, I'm thinking about my training. Like, I mean, you're burning through so much energy anyways. It's like, I don't know, like you're probably burning through like that extra saturated fat a little bit more. I mean, I'm not saying it wouldn't, for somebody at risk, it still wouldn't maybe put them at risk, but you're just burning through so much energy. It's probably less of a concern in
Yeah.
general, but it's not to say that you don't eat healthy food and you just eat, but you have like, let's say that 80/20, like if you're having 4,000 calories, you have a little bit more wiggle room too to be able to kind of have like maybe more cheeseburgers or something, or, fatty, really fatty cheeseburger, or even like a fattier kind of meat. So I would say that there's probably some nuance there for sure. Because if you're struggling when you're doing a high volume training to get enough calories, that might be like an avenue to try to get additional calories if it doesn't make you feel overly full.
Okay.
So let's switch gears and talk a little bit of thoughts about like fats and their role in recovery
Yeah.
potentially. I think the biggest thing is like it's not like carbs or protein where it's like a timing issue. Like you need to get something right away to get that recovery benefit. Fat doesn't have that kind of timing thing to it. Carbs and protein are still going to be like the biggest recovery tool. So fats kind of come in more from maybe a supportive role, a calorie role, like a heart healthy sort of general health aspect, maybe additional calories, like I said, but it's not something where, okay, you need to make sure you get fat within 60 minutes. I think if you're trying to hit a fat goal for the day, obviously, like whatever you eat afterwards, if you could include some healthy fat, it's probably not going to hurt, but
Okay.
it's just not going to be like a time thing. But the two that like want to mention, I already mentioned omega-3 fatty acids, and there is some benefit potentially to endurance athletes in reducing soreness, and
Okay.
they have an anti-inflammatory aspect. I kind of think about that. I'm like, well, we have to be a little bit careful right after exercise, taking things that are going to have too much of an anti inflammatory mechanism, because we do need that little bit of inflammation to get that process of adaptation, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes when I take my omega-3 fatty, it just so happens that I take them at night before bed because that's kind of when I remember. I don't think everyone has to do that, but it's just maybe taking it, but maybe not necessarily taking that supplement right after, but there could be some benefit for reducing soreness. I think there's some research that's kind of mixed on whether it could help with like even like muscle protein synthesis. I think that's really just kind of hit or miss in the research, but there's some heart healthy benefits. It's definitely something that's going to help with reducing inflammation and having a better. So there's a lot of talk too about like omega-3 to omega-6. And again, this is just where the double bond is placed. So there's like
Mhm.
omega-3 fats, omega-6 fats, that if we have a better ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, it's a little bit less inflammation. And so the best way to do that is just make sure you have enough of those omega-3s to have that ratio be where you want it. Gosh, I wish I could. Now I'm thinking of, okay, what would be the recommendation for omega-3? Because there's like DHA and EPA, and I know sometimes there's like separate recommendations. I would say anywhere between like 1 to 3 grams, so 1,000 to 3,000 milligrams of a good mixture of both. Sometimes it's very hard to find one
Mhm.
that's perfectly balanced. Sometimes there's more DHA and less EPA or vice versa, but just somewhere in that range. And if I find any very like specific recommendations that I could like actually provide, I'll include that in like the blog post. But in general, something around that amount is probably going to be useful. I know they're expensive. So if you're like, I can't take 3 grams a day, that's like $100 a month of fish oil. I don't know. I get
Yeah.
it. So maybe just take one like tablet of like 1,000 milligrams a day. The other one, we talked about like monounsaturated fats. They're just more of like the heart healthy. There's not really any additive benefit for performance, but just putting that out there. And then I did mention the conjugated linoleic acids are found in mostly dairy. So this is another reason to eat that high fat yogurt, right?
Mhm.
Like the full fat yogurt, or at least at 2%. They're actually a form of trans fats, which is interesting because we didn't mention trans fats, probably because I think they've been so villainized. I think most people are aware, like, oh, we don't want trans fats. But this is actually a naturally occurring trans fat that actually may have some benefit. It was shown in animal research that it had some benefit for reducing body fat, but it hasn't really translated a whole lot in human. And again, it's so hard to do research in humans anyways, but I think it's a worth a mention. So I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to like buy this type of fat and pay for it and take it as a supplement, but it may be another really good reason to take it, take in some of that dairy, full fat dairy versus low fat, because it may help. And and it has, benefits otherwise for potentially for positive health aspects. So one to think about. And yeah, I mean, there's no, again, in saturated fat, we sort of mentioned already, there's no real benefit for athletes to take a ton of additional saturated fat. So that's definitely not one I would recommend like really overdoing. And I think that's pretty much it.
So if fat's role in recovery, is it just for caloric replacement, or is there something
Yeah,
else that is there?
not really. It's kind of there for
Okay.
caloric. I mean, it's there for like the health aspect of it. Like, so fat does have a role, we have like this like a deeper role of like triglycerides, cholesterol, like what's happening in our arteries and kind of that flow of fat throughout the body and where it's being placed and how it's being utilized. And that it's just more of like a background, like just general health thing. There's no specific special thing to like athletes that I'm aware
Yeah.
of that's like this is going to give you the edge. Or if you just take in this one other than maybe omega 3s, like if you just take in this extra fat, this type of fat, you're going to be able to recover faster, or it's going to give you some kind of benefit. I think it's just making sure you're getting enough to meet to get those essential fats and meet your needs, and then making sure that the fats you're taking in are balanced so that you have that heart healthy benefit. And I mean, heart is important for endurance athletes, right? We
Yeah.
want to have a healthy heart, so we kind of need that organ to be able to do what we do, right? So in that way, it's helpful, but there's no like performance like timing or anything like that is going to benefit performance. So I think that's why it's not talked about.
Yeah, we've talked before about, protein's role in recovery and where it starts to, it's protein synthesis where we're rebuilding torn muscle fibers, right? And we've
Mhm.
talked about the consumption of carbohydrates in terms of its refilling of glycogen stores. So if we had like one takeaway from, okay, well then what's fat's role in recovery as it's, one of the three macronutrients? We can just say it's just caloric replacement, and to a certain degree, depending on the fat, could be an inflammation reducer, right? So that's kind of its main role in recovery is just to replace the caloric expenditure from the training session.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of a inflammation
Yeah.
piece,
Okay.
because of depending on the portions of the fat we're eating, just making sure we're being aware of that. But there's no, I think that's probably why it isn't talked about a lot in endurance, because there's not, I think people like to have like, a takeaway, like you're saying,
Yeah.
take the protein and do this and have the carbs right away. And there's something like people can take away from that and be like, I can do that. It's going to directly enhance my performance. Like with fat, there's nothing like that. And so it's just not talked about a lot. But I think sometimes people don't know, like they don't think about how fat might be like more satiating, or they don't think about the foods they're eating with fat and how maybe it will benefit their overall health. Or even from an inflammatory standpoint, I do think it's important to think about omega 3s versus omega 6, that ratio. And if you're having a lot of inflammatory symptoms, maybe that's something, there's tests you can do to look in the different types of fats and see kind of what your portion of fats are. Like, maybe it's like an omega 3 index or some kind of lab work you can do. If you want to dig deep and kind of see what's happening, you can do that. But yeah, in that sense, maybe, but it's not like being, I can be like, this is a
Yeah.
takeaway. I think the biggest one would be like, if you're not doing omega 3s, like consider that for sure. But otherwise, yeah, no big takeaways, just general.
All
So
right.
nothing sexy.
Is there anything else that we want to discuss about fats, or
So I feel like
anything
I'm
else
gonna
is
think
probably
of
going to be
something
kind of
later that
its
I'm
own.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. And I
There's
like we
probably.
mentioned, maybe we can always do like a separate, like if I'm like come across something else, like
Yeah.
we can always do like a little mini kind of like deep dive into something, or if some, another
I mean, we
topic
know
comes
that
up, I
something
can
like
mention it.
fat utilization is it's so broad in that it's
Mhm.
probably an episode unto
Yeah, I think
itself.
that
But
is an episode
I
on
think
its
that's
own.
the
Yeah.
only kind of piece of this puzzle that that people are probably really
asking
kind of
about.
tuned
Yeah.
into is just like, oh, but this is what I want to know about. We didn't want to discuss that too much because this podcast then would be kind of like 2-3 hours. So
Yeah, I think that whole metabolic, almost like there's a couple terms, metabolic flexibility, which is kind of the
yeah,
ability to kind of switch from fat burning to carb burning a little more easily, or efficiency, our flexibility, and then the efficiency. So, which is maybe more like that piece of being able to burn fat more readily while you're in exercise. So I think that those are a topic we can almost explore in a whole, a whole episode on its own. And I do want to go down that route. I think we will, at some point, hopefully fairly soon. But I want to make sure that I have all my ducks in a row. I know a lot about it, but I think that one may take a little more of like
yeah.
planning and preparation on my part to make sure I have kind of all of the pieces in place to be able to provide some good information on that topic that's useful.
Well, I think we also need to understand the basics of fat and its role within the nutrition. So we had to set the proverbial table first
Right.
before we
Yeah,
dive deeper
exactly.
into it. So I think we covered this topic pretty well.
Yeah, I think
If we
so.
don't have anything else, let's do a little bit of the housekeeping. So we have a private Facebook group out there that we're trying to build out the community for. So it's the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast group. So you just go out there and you answer one simple question and we let you right on in. This will be kind of the primary location of communication about things that are going on with the podcast, new podcast episode releases, any kind of additional content that we're going to be coming out with is probably going to be pushed out into this particular group. It'll be also a great place for you to reach out to us directly to suggest other topics that we haven't covered yet that you're interested in, or if we get to the point where we want to take on Q&A episodes, this will be the area of interest that you will want to be in. So check that out. It's the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast group. If you want to reach out to us directly through email, it's theenduranceathletejourney@gmail.com. So please just go ahead and send us an email. We monitor that daily, and we will respond. I can't really. We are both taking on athletes onto our rosters, so we are both actively recruiting and seeking out athletes. So if you are thinking about what you want to accomplish in 2026, please consider us. You can go, and if you want to reach out to Katie, you can go to fuel2run.com, and you can check out her site. All of her content is out there, blog and articles and some of her history. You can reach out to her there. If you want to reach out to me and you're interested in multi-sport or single sport, I do both, but I do not do the nutrition side. That's only Katie. You can go to tabularossaracing.com, and you can check out my coaching philosophy and all the content that I have out there. There's a blog. There's podcast episodes. There's the training for Florida. It's got its own dedicated page where you'll see my training plan, and all the videos that I've been releasing is located out there as well. I can't think of it. Is there any other housekeeping rule things that we have? I don't think so either. Wherever you're enjoying this podcast from, whether it's Spotify, Amazon, Audible, or wherever it's coming from, and you're enjoying the content or you're not enjoying the content, go out and send us, rate us, give us a review, put a little comment on there, and tell us what you think. It is greatly appreciated. The more reviews that we can accumulate, the easier it is to reach others that are interested in this particular topic as well for endurance sports. It just helps other people find us as well. So if you're enjoying the content, go ahead and review us and give us a comment. It's greatly appreciated. We also have the YouTube channel. So the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast has a YouTube channel where you can enjoy not only these episodes, so we have a recorded where you can see both Katie and I on the screen. Is all of the episodes are out there as well.
You know what, Justin?
That's an option. So
I
what's
just
that?
thought of one more thing with fat that I didn't
Yeah, go ahead. Let's do that.
Okay, one more thing. I was like, gosh, there's something I feel like I'm missing. And okay, so there are certain nutrients that we do need fat for absorption. And I do think of like vitamin D or some of our fat-soluble vitamins.
Yeah, okay.
So if I had to put like a little addendum, or hopefully people made it this far. But that's one thing I thought of is like, yes, fat is important for other aspects of just like absorbing some of those fat-soluble vitamins. So Don't forget
And vitamin
about
D
that.
is really important for endurance
Yes,
athletes.
it is. Yes.
So
Yeah. So if you're taking a supplement of vitamin D, sometimes they're in like a little bit of like oil or something, but make
yep,
sure you take that with some fat so you actually absorb it. So there you go. I thought of one. I was like,
there it is.
there's something I may be missing here. That was it.
So
I think
all right.
maybe there's more, but I think that's the big one. All right. We're good.
All right, so thank you for joining us on this episode of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. This was episode 40 on the role of fat for endurance athletes. I'm your host, Coach Justin, along with Coach Katie. We want to thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you all again next week. All right, Katie, have a good night.
You too. Bye, Justin.
Listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Feel free to leave us up to a 5-star review on iTunes and Spotify because leaving a review really helps others like you find us. Visit the podcast website for other episodes of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast at enduranceathletejourney.buzzsprout.com. Have questions or comments about the podcast? Send Coach Justin and Katie an email at theenduranceathletejourney@gmail.com. For all things coaching, visit Coach Katie at fuel2run.com and Coach Justin at tabularasaracing.com. Again, thank you for listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, and remember to find joy in the journey.